Good afternoon and welcome to my channel. The name of the channel is Angry Taxpayer and I'm your host, Donna Smirniotopoulos. And this is week 5 of COVID-19 shutdown. I haven't taken to YouTube for many weeks. I've been focusing on my blog and, like many of you, just kind of burying my head under the covers and waiting for this all to be over, this kind of horrific nightmare of mostly fear and panic. I realize that their lives have been lost and there's a great deal of sadness. And I lost a loved one late Saturday night, my former mother-in-law who lived in a nursing home in Wilton. I was lucky enough to be able to go see her last Wednesday. And we don't know, we may never know that she died of COVID-19. We know that the disease is in the nursing homes, and once it gets into a nursing home, it's very hard to keep it from spreading. One of the problems is you need a lot of staff in a nursing home, and those staff members go home to their families. So extremely difficult to stop this from spreading. Having said that, I will say in the case of my mother-in-law, when I saw her last Wednesday, I didn't see any, didn't have a fever. She was not coughing. She did not seem to be experiencing any respiratory distress. So the disease moves in mysterious ways. Her son, my former husband, opted not to have her tested because the recommendation in the nursing home is if it doesn't change how you're going to treat the disease, why test? And we knew that she was not going to be transported to a hospital. She was not going to be intubated. There was a DNR already in place. These are some of the factors around COVID-19 that a lot of people aren't really talking about, which is a large portion of the very elderly population. They already have plans in place, and many of them already have DNRs and DNIs. And ventilators are not a great way to go for somebody over 85. The survival rate is pretty low. It's around 20%. So when we talk about ventilators and COVID-19 and someone with active disease, it's a way of buying them time so that they can continue to breathe until they are able to resolve the virus. It is not a cure. A ventilator is not a cure. And in fact, there are some doctors who are questioning the extensiveness of the use of ventilators, how early in the disease process people are being intubated, and whether or not the manifestation of the findings that are consistent with acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, whether those findings are caused by the ventilator rather than by COVID-19. So there's a lot of unanswered questions at this point about COVID-19. Now, I was just referring to the confusion about, at least coming from one particular doctor in Brooklyn, about whether or not early ventilator use, early intubation, is the right way to go for every patient. Certainly ventilators are critically important, but Governor Cuomo's claim that he was going to be 26,000 ventilators short, that has not been borne out, and I think New York has reached the peak. Today is the 16th of April, and they were supposed to reach the peak over the weekend. So because I like to put humor into everything, in spite of the fact that one of my former neighbors called me out on Nextdoor the other day and she said, "You're as guilty as hell." I guess I stand accused and, guilty as charged. I think that we should try and find a way to laugh through our tears. So I am going to go through a list of my COVID heroes. It's a pretty short list. For Dr. Dreamy, I have top honors going to Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the head of allergies and infectious diseases at NIH, National Institutes of Health. We see Dr. Fauci almost every day. God bless him. He's 79. He doesn't need to be doing this. He is doing this voluntarily. I think he's been very good at dealing with the press, and the press is on this relentless mission to find failure. They're almost looking for disaster. So I'm not going to give an A+ to Donald Trump. I think he's it's been a mixed bag, but I wouldn't give him any lower grade than I would give Andrew Cuomo as an example. I would give him a higher grade than I would give Governor Lamont. I think that California Governor Gavin Newsom was a little more prescient than the rest of us, but also we may find in time that California was ahead of the curve because the virus had been in the community for months and there's a certain amount of herd immunity there. So that's my number one candidate for Dr. Dreamy is Dr. Anthony Fauci, and my number two candidate is Dr. John Ioannidis. He is based at Stanford University, and he has written some excellent papers about COVID-19 and how little we know about the disease. And he was one of the first people to start mentioning that all the deaths in Italy, COVID-19 was present, but we don't know that COVID-19 caused the death. And this kind of gets back to that other theory about whether or not ventilators are always indicated. The longer you're on a ventilator, the harder it is to come off of it, the more damage to your lungs, and then, the presence of comorbidities. So we don't know in many of those Italian cases, and we don't know here yet because of the way we're recording the data on COVID-19 deaths. We don't know if people died from something else. And the other thing we don't know, and this is especially true of the elderly, if we use my late mother-in-law as an example, she was diagnosed with bacterial pneumonia a few weeks ago, and she was treated for that. So, at any given time in any setting, but especially in nursing homes, someone could come down with bacterial pneumonia and they may not survive that state. So I guess what we're saying is that when someone gets to be in their 80s and 90s, there are a lot of opportunistic viruses. This is why we tell older people stay out of the hospital. We don't know how many people are succumbing to this because they're entering a hospital setting to begin with. And, they could become victim of hospital-acquired pneumonia, and survival rates for that are extremely low for older people. So now I want to get to Dr. Steamy, and he is my heartthrob. He's one of my favorites. His name is Dr. Cameron Kyle-Sidell, and he is an ER physician at Maimonides in Brooklyn. So he's been a frontline person on COVID-19, and I encourage you to look at his YouTube videos if you're interested, as I am, in learning more about the disease process and what's working and what's not working, and why ventilators, we need to use them with caution. I suggest that you look for his videos. He did a really great explanation using a wipe-off board on ARDS the other day. I found it really helpful. Not everybody's interested in this kind of thing. I am. It happens to interest me. I come from a medical family, and they're a bunch of smarty pants, and they know way more than I do. So I like to try and keep up. But I was concerned about the use of ventilators weeks ago when Governor Cuomo said that 80% of people on ventilators were dying, were not coming off of them. And in my mind, and we know that, for older people, outcomes are not good on ventilators to begin with. But if the overall rate of recovery for the ventilators was 20%, what that told me, not being a doctor, but just kind of, having a logical mind, maybe the ventilators are the problem. Maybe not everybody should be ventilated. Maybe they shouldn't be ventilated so early. I spoke to my brother about this. He is a critical care specialist, and he has intubated plenty of people in his day. And to his knowledge, one of the reasons people were being intubated early was not that there was a shortage of ventilators, but that there was a shortage of doctors and staff. And so the wisdom was, since the disease can progress very quickly, very rapidly to a critical point, doctors were being advised to intubate early. In other words, before the patient needed that support for their breathing. So we may find out that that wasn't the right way to go. And I hope that we can learn something. You can't expect, people were told, doctors were told, this is like ARDS, this is like a pneumonia. And according to Dr. Cameron Kyle-Sidell, this is nothing like what he's ever seen in terms of patients with ARDS caused by pneumonia or other sort of respiratory disorder. So in Norwalk news, the Common Council met remotely, virtually. They had like a Zoom meeting, And I didn't watch it, but I was told by my dear friend Lisa Brinton, who did watch it, and good for you, Lisa, that you're keeping up with this stuff, that really no one said anything, which is kind of like a regular meeting, unless there are people watching, and then they will have rehearsed whatever it is that they were supposed to say ahead of time if it's a controversial subject. But no one really said anything. So we are going to get a slight extension in our property tax deadlines, which is a good thing, but there has been no promise to hold the line on property taxes. I'm not getting a check. Many people are getting checks from the federal government. I am not getting a check because this is based on 2018. So I wish it were based on 2020, because I think if it were, I would be getting a check. And if my taxes are going to go up $1,000, which they may, because they can't seem to hold the line on particularly the school budget, I mean, I think that's really unfair and unfortunate. We don't have an economy that's really working right now. And to my knowledge, there's not been a single furlough, not only here in Norwalk, but at the state level, at the federal level. In the past, when we've had government shutdowns, there's been some furloughing. So, and that furlough might simply involve, you only work 4 days a week, or you're only paid for 4 days a week, but you're really staying home the whole time. Most of the Norwalk government is working from home or not working at all, and they're continuing to draw paychecks. This is not true of the private sector. So I hope the mayor is listening. It's really unfair to punish disproportionately the private sector, and then the government just keeps humming along, and they're drawing their paychecks, and they don't have to worry because they have a government pension. So these are things we need to keep in mind. I would like to hold the line on taxes. I think it's really important. You don't want to drive people out of the city at this time. Now, Governor Lamont supposedly is going to talk today about the possibility of reopening the government, allowing businesses to open. And it sounds like one of the plans under consideration, based on a post by Darien Selectman Jamie Stevenson, is some sort of contact tracing, tracking, and having to pre-screen people. I don't know if this would involve immunity certificates or anything like that. I don't see this working in America, period, let alone in Fairfield County. I really don't see how this is going to work. I would like to see a model closer to what is going on in Sweden, which is if you are vulnerable, and vulnerability in the case of this illness is age, underlying conditions like COPD, asthma, so any underlying respiratory condition, but particularly diabetes and obesity. Obesity is a huge risk factor for COVID-19. So are we going to continue to shut everything down in order to protect those people? Or would it be better to tell people, you're in a risk category and you need to protect yourself? And maybe since you're in a risk category, because remember, the reason we shut everything down is we were worried about overwhelming the hospitals. And so once we reach the point where that's not a danger, then maybe it makes sense to ask people who are more vulnerable to requiring hospitalization and some kind of, an ICU bed, possibly a ventilator. Maybe we ask those people to protect themselves, take some ownership for their personal health. Maybe it's a good time for all of us to go on a diet and lose some weight, because Americans, it turns out, are super fat, and New Orleans is even fatter than the rest of us. And that's one of their mayor admitted it. This is why people are dying in New Orleans. One of the reasons, their health isn't good, and obesity is part of the problem. So I would really struggle with any kind of enhanced surveillance. This is what they've done in Germany. I've called it the Stasi reincarnated, because they never stopped watching, maybe. This is what has worked in South Korea. They have closed circuit TV everywhere. I think Americans don't really like the idea of being watched all the time. We have Americans reluctant to fill out their census surveys. So I don't think this is going to go over very well here, and I think people are reaching the point where there's going to be civil unrest if we don't come up with a solution right quick. In other news, the Board of Education announced that they have hired a new superintendent. Her name is Alexandra Estrella. or Estrella. And she is a superintendent in New York City schools. She's a superintendent of, I don't remember exactly, community schools. You know, I looked at her LinkedIn, and what I found was that there was some telegraphing of her political positions on her LinkedIn recommendations. I don't want to read too much into that, but when I saw the hashtag White Fragility, and there's a book by that name called White Fragility, and it looked like she was giving that a big thumbs up. So a concern for Norwalk is, you know, it's great that we have a superintendent coming in who is fluent in Spanish, because we have a lot of Spanish speakers, and then there are, among that subset, many who are not yet speaking English, and they're being given English language instruction. So those are really good things. But what concerns me about the hashtag White Fragility, and I don't want to tie that to her too much, because I think it's a little unfair, but that becomes sort of the cop-out whenever anybody says, I can't sustain another tax increase to pay for the school budget. Oh, well, then that's going to be hashtag White Fragility. So you're just one of these white people who you just don't get it. And the reason that you are denying racism is that you're too fragile. And so, you know, I think we have to be really careful to avoid those kinds of attachments of white fragility to any sort of objection to tax increases in order to support what I see as a bloated school budget. And there are all kinds of ways to bring this budget under control. Henry Dashowitz wrote a really great memo about it, and I think he's right. We need to look at the entire school budget. And in my opinion, you know, and this is just my opinion, but I think SEL, social emotional learning, I think that's kind of a waste of money. I want them to focus on learning. And after we finish this exercise of remote learning, I think we're going to find that the K through 5 kids really need the one-on-one instruction with the teachers. And the older kids many of them will have learned very well remotely. And maybe we need to adjust our budget and our priorities accordingly. But if we're not hiring paraprofessionals so that we can delay start time, so we can pay another $500,000 on our transportation contract, I think that's a mistake, in my opinion. And I hope that when Dr. Estrella comes and, you know, starts her work here, that she understands how this budget is being funded, because we are not getting the help we need from the state. No thanks to Bob Duff. And so I hope that she has sensitivity to the people who are, you know, scraping together in order to stay in their homes and pay these taxes. And most of us do not have kids in school. We see this everywhere where senior citizens, you know, the kids age out and they're no longer, they're paying for something that they're not using. But the disconnect here between the consumer of public education and the funding of public education, it's a pretty big disconnect. And if no one on the Board of Education had that conversation with her, that's a mistake. You need to have that conversation with her now so she understands where we're coming from. And, you know, if the state were doing their part, I think we would feel differently about some of these costly initiatives like teaching American Sign Language, which, again, in my opinion, total waste of money. And you can't say, let's not have that, because people start pointing fingers at you and saying, well, a good education shouldn't be about zip code and all this other BS. The bottom line is we aren't getting the help we need from Hartford. Bob Duff is doing nothing to help bring more money to Norwalk, and we have a very high need school district. I hope that Dr. Estrella understands this, and happy to be her head cheerleader if she does. I hope that you all are going to have a great rest of the day. My last little plug here, and I know I'm going on, you know, coming up in 20 minutes, but I have a holiday coming up, and it is Greek Easter, and so this is my new best friend. I have another one buried under here someplace, which is the typical Greek cookbook is something that came out of the ladies' Philoptochos, and so you'll see multiple versions of the same thing, like koulourakia, which is a basic cookie, you know, so there are going to be 5 or 6 different versions of that, because in Greek culture, everything is a competition. And I think the saddest part about not being able to celebrate Greek Easter with family is we compete by cracking eggs. And so no one gets to be a winner, nobody gets to be a loser. That's really sad for us. We don't get to sing the Christos Anesti song. If you're Greek, Orthodox Christian, or even if you enjoy a good laugh, I suggest that you tune in to Mr. Panos. He did 2 COVID-19 videos, and they're extremely funny, especially if you know the traditions. I wish you all a great day, and I hope to see you soon. Please check out my blog. It's angrytaxpayernorwalk.com. Yeah, very different than this face-to-face thing. But bye, everybody. Have a great afternoon and a great weekend, and let's pray to have some resolution and open up soon, because I think we all need to get back to normal. Thanks.